the thing that keeps me up at night is wanting everyone in the world to live a dignified life and trying to figure out how we can actually get there. How can our society have access to quality education, quality healthcare, quality job opportunities?
If you could ask Sam Altman one honest question right now, what would it be?
What degree of harm do you need to see in order to change course?
We turn now to The Empire of AI. That's the name of a new book by the journalist Karen Hao, who's closely reported on the rise of the artificial intelligence industry with a focus on Sam Altman's OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT. Karen Hao compares the actions of the AI industry to those of colonial powers in the past.
Joining us right now is tech journalist Karen Hao, whose latest book is out today. It's called Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. The book is a culmination of over 300 interviews conducted over the last 7 years. You were writing about OpenAI before anybody had any idea what this was. Your first kind of take on them was 2019. How did you find them and what did you think?
Very excited to introduce you today to Karen Hao, our guest, who is an award-winning journalist covering the impacts of artificial intelligence on society. She writes for the publications including The Atlantic, and she leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series. She was formerly a tech reporter for the Wall Street Journal and a senior editor for AI at MIT Technology Review. She has received numerous accolades for her coverage, including the American National Magazine Award for Journalists Under 30. She received her BS in Mechanical Engineering from MIT. As Karen is on a global tour on the occasion of her book launch, The Empire of AI, and I'm going to show you guys this, Empire of AI, right? Today, we'll explore one of the most critical conversations shaping our societal future, the cost of unprecedented scale and consumption. Hence, it's going to be, I don't doubt, a fascinating discussion. Karen, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for having me.
One question that we need to understand a little bit more about our guest's background that I absolutely love asking, if anything, is before we dive in, what do you think would be the 3 words that you would best use to describe yourself?
Curious, lifelong learner, you know what? Lifelong learner.
Love it. That's the 3 words, isn't it? Love it. Love it. That actually describes, like, you know, the amount of work that you've put in the book itself, right? The actual grit, the curiosity that stands behind it. So thank you for sharing that. I can see this 3. The other one that I can ask as part of the background and what has helped to become or to make you become you is that question around what were you as a child? Can you let us know what were some of the passions, traits from the early years that have stayed with you, and if there were any mentors along the way?
Yeah, I think very much I was raised in a family that really emphasized both STEM, mathematics, science, technology, engineering, as well as the humanities. And I very much think that has shaped the course that I've taken in my career, focusing on covering tech, but as a journalist, and always blending a technical and humanitarian background together. And that was very much shaped by my parents, who both share interest in both, as both of them were engineers. And then my mom also became a teacher. So very much that kind of blended approach to education.
Nice. So would you count them as your main mentors in your becoming?
I think so. From when I was a young child until, I left the nest to go to college, I very much think they had a huge role in shaping and mentoring my trajectory.
And talking about the trades, because obviously as being a child raised by engineers, with a nice focus on when it comes to humanitarians, but also on the actual mathematics and the background on a little bit more precise scientific angle. Yeah. What would you count as some of the key skills that you might have either inherited or built up along the way?
Definitely always wondering how things work and having a desire to explain that as well. I think one of the traits that I developed early on was being able to translate between different disciplines, different ideas, and also different cultures. I'm Chinese American, so a lot of my childhood was about learning how to translate Chinese culture for Americans and American culture for Chinese people, and learning to step in to different worlds and very quickly kind of understand the norms and culture within that world and respect it and be able to operate within those environments. And it's the same thing translating between humanities and tech communities. It's almost like two cultures that you have to bridge. So I think that was probably the key skill that I developed early on.
It's exciting. This is reminding me of a book that we've just shortlisted as part of the Business Book Awards here in the UK. I'm one of the judges, and the book is called Bridging the Gap, and is being written by one of the Chinese, scientists. And the level of details in terms of the cultural aspect and how deep it can be when it comes to the research and how to fit in as part of the both cultural aspects. It's quite fascinating itself. So I can't recommend that book more. In fact, I'm reading it and uncovering more and more new things along the way. And as part of your beliefs, to understand a little bit more about the background and, how you're guiding yourself these days, because I appreciate that you mentioned just now that you have been guided by this perennial question around what, and how things work and what actually makes them work, what makes them tick for you. My next question, to be able to understand some of your, beliefs and something that you find as guidance in the current stream, is what keeps you up at night and inspires you to go that extra mile?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night is wanting everyone in the world to live a dignified life and trying to figure out how we can actually get there. How can everyone in our society have access to quality education, quality healthcare, quality job opportunities, feel fulfillment, and participate in determining our collective future? And that's something that has always been, throughout my life, something that I've been very preoccupied by. When I was in high school and university, I first started thinking about sustainability and environmental issues, in part because I saw that was a primary obstacle to people living a dignified life, and all the way until present day, thinking about the way that AI is also, if not developed well, could constrain the ability of many people to live that dignified life, is just one thing that I'm always wrestling with. How can I just continue to help that cause?
That's a very respectable mission on its own, and the course of action, I think, is nicely matching up with the root of how you've researched the book itself here, because you're coming up with a lot of details when it comes to understanding the intricacies around the operational aspect of OpenAI as the main player, or one of the main players now in the field. Now that there's a competition around, isn't it? But it's also the implication of where is it all leading and going to. So we'll definitely tap into that a little bit more. But my question around the empire of AI and in terms of its mission, I'll give a little bit more of a prelude into here, is because the book already has been proudly talked about as the heroic work of essential public education. And it's been labeled as such. It reveals not only the historical significance of societal consequences of Silicon Valley's AI spectacle, but also documents a company and its leaders as hellbound on getting there first, with no idea where they're getting, right? It's something that Shoshana Zuboff powerfully puts it. To bring these books to life, you conducted 300 interviews altogether with 260 people, out of which I think in total 90 were current or former OpenAI executives. And as part of that, you also had 40 interviews with some other current or former executives of some of the big tech companies, such as Google, the Microsoft, Anthropic, Meta, DeepMind, of course, Scale, and people that are close to Sam Altman himself. Now, while the book offers vital insight into the ideology and inner workings of some of the world's most influential AI labs, what do you hope the public will feel and do after reading this story, and what's the ideal reaction you're hoping to inspire?
The thing that I wanted to convey the most with my book is, I think most people encounter AI or any technology and think that it's inevitable. This is just the way that it would have naturally evolved. But technology is actually a product of human choices. And the AI tools that are now diffusing rapidly across our society, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, these were the product of human choices as well, and specifically the product of a very small group of humans' choices. And what I argue in the book and my title, Empire of AI, really nods to this argument that I'm quite critical of the choices that they made and the particular direction that they have chosen to pursue AI development, because there is an extraordinary level of environmental harms, social harms, and labor harms that are actually coming out of this trajectory of AI development. And I hope people can take away that ultimately, if technology is shaped by people, they themselves can also shape the future of AI to make it more broadly beneficial.
I love how you put it in terms of the choice element of it, right? Because when we're thinking about what has come out of AI development so far, it seems, as you put yourself, it's been a choice of a very few selected people as opposed to the choice of many. What do we think needs to happen for it to become the choice of many in its future trajectory?
Yeah, so one of the things I try to highlight in my book that people don't really realize is digital technologies have very physical supply chains. There are a lot of people involved along the way that are hidden human workers that people usually never hear about. I talk about some of the workers that OpenAI contracted in Kenya, for example, to help develop ChatGPT. There's also really large infrastructure that's built to support this technology. So I went to Chile, to Arizona, to other places around the world to see data centers being laid for the training of these technologies. And all of these different aspects, all of these ingredients that go into developing AI, whether it's the data that these companies scrape from the internet or the intellectual property that they take or the lands, energy, and water used to build and power their data centers, all of these are actually sites of what I think of as democratic contestation, where if you as a community are seeing a data center entering your community and you don't actually find it mutually beneficial, that is something you can push back on. If you as an artist feel like your intellectual property was stolen and you don't find that mutually beneficial, that is something you can push back on. And in fact, we've seen artists, writers, and creators start suing these companies as that kind of pushback. And these companies, once they develop their AI tools, they also have to deploy that technology in different spaces that, in fact, we collectively own, whether that's our schools, our hospitals, government agencies. And if teachers and students don't like the way that these companies are coming into their schools, they don't like the way that AI is affecting education, that is also something you can push back on. And so I think if we have more democratic contestation all along the supply chain of AI development and deployment, we will be able to shift the trajectory of AI to something that is more inclusive. And I sometimes draw an analogy to the fashion industry, because the fashion industry also had a lot of labor and environmental harms. And the answer was not, now everyone stop wearing clothes. We still have to have clothes, we still have to have fashion. But the answer is, based on the raising of awareness of those issues, consumers started shifting their behaviors, human rights organizations started pushing back on fashion brands, society started actually demanding something better. And that is what created new markets for ethically sourced fashion, sustainable fashion. And we were able to upgrade the supply chain to something that isn't so harmful while still getting the benefits.
I love the comparison that you're making with the fashion industry. I'm coming from the fashion industry, in fact, 10 years as a digital marketer in the fashion industry. And I actually, I'm coming from the fast fashion, right, where this element was actually quite poignant, and where we've seen the impact of outsourcing the labor in some, less developed countries where, the labor was not necessarily abundant to the fair trade in that sense. So
exactly.
you kind of needed to be aware in that sense as a retailer, but at the same time, to your point, if the communities were having a voice to actually push back on that, would come up with even larger impact, whatnot, isn't it? But even so, the fact that it's already a movement and a shift in that direction, it's already quite a pleasing element to know that it's happening.
Yeah.
And so now we're facing with the element of sustainability in fashion, not just, as you said, it's an ethical route that we're choosing in many directions. When it comes to AI and the developments it has seen throughout the years so far, and you've been quoted as one of the first journalists to actually be a long-standing researcher on the topic of AI for 7 years now, right? What do you think have been some of the core elements elements that society was not necessarily very attentive to when it was evolving in the earlier days, that it has achieved that mass market impact that it has at the moment. And if we reverse back the tone and the pacing, could there have been some elements that could have been avoided, or just to put us in a little bit more privileged position when it comes to the choice?
That's a great question. There's this book that I cite in my book called Power and Progress by two MIT economists, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. And their book focuses on analyzing the last 1,000 years of technology development and technology revolutions. Right. And one of the things that they conclude after this analysis is that technology revolutions often take a very similar shape, not because this is inevitable by any means, but because very often technology revolutions are ushered in through a small group of people that have a lot of blind spots or have a particularly narrow view about what technology should do. And it's usually the elites in society. They're the ones that have the resources. They're the ones that can rally all this talent. And therefore, the technologies that they birth end up being a reflection of something that supports the elites, but actually subjugates or harms the vast majority of people. And oftentimes that harm is a labor harm. These technologies end up being labor automating. We've seen that during the Industrial Revolution. We saw that even earlier with previous technology revolutions, where workers end up with fewer rights, people end up with less economic opportunity. And then there's a period in which there needs to be a course correction, because you start having a lot of social instability, social unrest from so many people suddenly confronting unemployment and confronting an inability to have a fulfilling and dignified life. And that's something that we are currently seeing with AI development, that I believe if we had been more attentive to this in the early days, we could have actually prevented that. And one of the challenges is because AI research as a field was initially pegged to this idea of, can we recreate human intelligence in computers? And one of the challenges of that is we don't actually have scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. There's no definition in biology, neuroscience, psychology. Yeah. So what scientists have done in the field is they've just benchmarked their models against human skills. And most often they benchmark off of human skills that are economically valuable. So actually OpenAI's definition of artificial general intelligence, this so-called idea of fully recreating human intelligence in AI, is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. So they are inherently trying to build, once again, a labor automating technology. And I think what Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson argue is we don't actually have to choose that path with technology revolutions. Most technology revolutions chose that path because they happened during a time when there was no human rights. There were no labor rights. There were no workers' rights. But actually, in modern day, in the 21st century, we have an opportunity to bring in technology revolutions when we've already had significant social progress, human rights progress, workers' rights progress. And so they really advocate for, and I agree, that we should be thinking about how do we develop AI to be assistive, not to replace people. Maybe the original premise of AI was to try and recreate human intelligence, but now that we are actually seeing the effects of that particular ideology and realizing that it's not all that good, we're now seeing early career jobs being automated. We're seeing the breaking of the career ladder. We should actually just demand a different vision. Yep. And there have been many research studies that have shown, for example, that when a well-trained doctor, actually is given an assistive AI tool, they can actually better diagnose cancer earlier in patients, or Alzheimer's earlier in patients, better than the AI doing it alone or the doctor doing it alone. So this is the kind of complementary human supported by AI approach that I think we need to actively choose more of in society.
Such a powerful point, and I'm very grateful that you're making it, because there's been this ad that I specifically just sourced for you that has been displayed in a London Underground station, particularly Old Street Notice, just 3 days ago. I'm not sure if you've seen it. Have you seen it?
No.
It says, "Stop hiring humans. The era of AI employees
I've
is
seen
here."
it in San Francisco. Yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly, it's funny because now companies used to be more subtle about what they were actually doing. And now, because of these AI technologies taking extraordinary amounts of resources and being extremely costly to develop, they're no longer subtle. Now they're just pitching to executives, buy our technology at thousands of dollars a month. And they justify it by saying, because then you don't have to hire workers. Like the only way to justify such a large cost is if it is actually replacing humans. And so before they would say, this is going to be amazing in the hands of people. Now they're just cutting the crap and saying, yeah, this will be amazing if you just replace people. And they're saying the quiet part out loud finally. But that, again, like this is not inevitable, and people should absolutely be pushing back against that particular vision.
See, that reminds me of the type of question that I often ask whoever we interview on the podcast that have connections to the developments in AI at the moment and the developments in the actual, human intelligence field as well, not just AI field, right? Because we kind of want to have the both sides clearly outlined. And the question I asked was around, how do you feel that AI is currently impacting your industry, and will there be some form of replacement of your role in future? And the answer that I'm seeing mostly coming through is that, I don't see it happening in my lifetime necessarily. So, not that it's inevitable or, yes, there is this element of, it's something that we should get along with, the reaction I get mostly. But it's like, what's your take on it in terms of as a human being, what can you do and say? I'm just, asking a more generic question here, right? To be able to push back, as you said yourself.
Well, it's so interesting. It is happening in people's lifetime. It's already happening right now. There is already economic data coming out of the US about how new college graduates, the job market is shrinking for them. And it's not just explainable by the economy having a slump. It's not just explainable by other factors. There was a piece in The Atlantic, one of the publications I write for, that explicitly said this might be the very first indicator of the actual job impact that AI is having, because we know from previous cycles of automation, when factories were automated, what happened first was the automation of those entry-level jobs. And companies will always say some jobs are destroyed and other jobs are created. That's 100% true, but they never say which jobs are destroyed and which ones are created.
That's a core point, yes.
Yeah, so it's the entry-level jobs that are destroyed. And then people who made it into the industry before that first layer was destroyed, there are new high-skilled jobs that are created that they can access. But then people who didn't yet make it into the industry before they were given the opportunity to train and rise up in the career ranks, there are new lower-skilled jobs that are also created, and they get stuck at the bottom. So the career ladder breaks. There is no longer an ability for a new graduate, whether from high school or from university, to go into the job market, take a few years to learn a craft, learn a profession, and then rise. They either can get over this giant obstacle or they never do. And so the chasm between highly skilled workers and low skilled workers increases. And that's exactly what economic data now is showing is happening with AI. So again, it wasn't inevitable, but it was highly predictable because of the path that these companies chose, which is let's just try and automate away most economically valuable work.
The point that you're making reminds me of another element here around the types of jobs that ideally, in the current circumstances, you would allow to get automated, and the types of jobs that you would rather get protected from that perspective, right? Do you feel that there's enough that's being done at the moment in terms of assuring that layer of, categorization of which jobs to protect and which jobs to allow to get automated is happening? Or?
Absolutely not.
Right. See? Okay. That's what I wanted to get us through to.
It's definitely not happening. And it's really unfortunate because I think most businesses in the long term will realize that if they automate away this bottom layer, it will actually not be sustainable for their business in the long term. But a lot of businesses operate in short-term decision-making cycles.
Yes, indeed.
And so we are seeing industries, the law firms, finance, Even healthcare, we are starting to see fewer and fewer of those entry-level jobs, and a lower and lower willingness of these industries to actually invest in their long-term workforce. And, there was a really funny story recently by Klarna, one of the
I was just
major
about
companies,
to say Klarna,
which they said, we're going to lay off a bunch of workers because we think this is now the AI era. We can replace all of them. And then a few weeks later, they said, whoopsie daisy, these AI models can't actually do this job very well. So they had to rehire those workers. So it also highlights a really key point that this job loss and this job automation is not just happening because of what the technology can do. Sometimes it happens in spite of the fact that the technology cannot perform at the level that humans do. It only requires executives to perceive that AI might be able to automate their workers away, and or to decide, well, the AI is cheaper than humans, so it's good enough. And that is what ultimately leads to the job loss, is the humans at the top that are making the decision to do these layoffs.
Sounds like, but by the sound of it, that there might need to be some form of an education at the C level to be able to give them the right decision-making tools, right? In terms of what the impact might be in case that they take those short-term decisions and they don't evaluate them properly for the long-term impact. Because in the case of Klarna, you've quite rightly pointed out, 700, I think, workers were returned as a result of that decision being remade. And as a result of that, they said that what AI couldn't replicate is that human connection element, right? Which is something that, is at the point in time is not there yet. But do we feel from the research that you've done already that there is this opportunity / potential trajectory in future whereby AI could get that level of consciousness, whereby it could emulate that human connection?
Certainly there's an opportunity for it to simulate the human connection, but there is no scientific evidence to suggest that AI will ever be able to fully develop consciousness or turn into an intelligence. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is the history of the term artificial intelligence itself is quite interesting, because it was originally coined in 1956 by an assistant professor at Dartmouth University, John McCarthy. And he said decades later himself, I invented the term artificial intelligence because I needed some money for a summer study. So it was a PR stunt. It was a rebranding of work that he was already doing under a different name, automata studies. He realized very quickly that automata studies sounds very esoteric. It doesn't capture the same amount of interest as artificial intelligence. And so the idea of even saying that these tools have intelligence is in and of itself rooted in marketing, not in science. And so the conversations today around, is AI going to ultimately develop consciousness? Is it going to have sentience? Is it going to have these things that we typically associate with human intelligence? That is a legacy of a poorly chosen marketing phrase. Again, there is no scientific evidence. It is heavily contested. And in fact, the New York Times recently just published an article with the headline, "Why We're Not Going to Have Artificial General Intelligence Anytime Soon." And there was a survey of some of the most longstanding and respected AI researchers in the field that the article cited, and 75% of them think that we do not even have the techniques for getting anywhere close to replicating human intelligence. So we should really be thinking of AI as not something that is ultimately going to achieve the same thing that humans can achieve, but is a product of companies trying to automate away what humans are usually paid for.
Right. So would you say, in terms of it being perceived as the medium for that communication that could be looked at as a human type of touch, human type of connection, it's more of a wannabe rather than the actual factology or the actual route that can be taken on?
Exactly, because ultimately they're products, and these companies are businesses. So one of their primary incentives is to just create something that they can get paid for. And what's better than to market to executives of really high-powered industries and say, what is the service that you want? Oh, you want to shrink your workforce, create cost efficiencies? I'll give you a technology that does that.
Got you. Yeah, it's a very complex, also the terminology of itself, right? And the fact that it's already so rooted in the minds of, the global arena of many. But what do you think might be a fairer definition of these LLMs these days, so that they're not called artificial intelligence, but what was, the fairer route of them being called as?
I would call them automated human decision-making machines.
Okay.
They are automating both the human decisions that were made when shaping the technology. They also then automate away the human decision-making that would have happened if AI wasn't replacing the workforce, the human workforce. And I think that makes it much clearer what's actually happening here. It is, these technologies are not neutral. They're actually extensions of whatever the person who created them wanted them to do. Yeah. And they are going to continue perpetuating. They will be deployed in places that maybe we ultimately want to preserve as having human touch. There's this researcher that I reference in the book. His name is Joseph Weizenbaum, and he was an MIT professor in the 1950s and 60s, who was actually the inventor of the first chatbot, very pre-ChatGPT. Yeah, so that his chatbot was called Eliza, and Eliza was quite similar to ChatGPT in that you could just talk to it as a chatbot, but you typed on a typewriter, and the typewriter was connected to a mainframe, those giant computers that were the size of huge rooms. But it worked very differently than ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a statistical engine. It's calculating and computing the human language and then trying to spit back out sentences that feel like they mirror what you're saying. Eliza was hard-coded. So if you said something like, "I'm sad today," it would spit back, "Why are you sad today?" So it would just take the phrase and then flip I to you and my boyfriend to your boyfriend, whatever it was. And originally Weizenbaum actually wanted to develop this as a way to demonstrate to the broader public how vulnerable we as humans are to believing that there's more to a machine when it appears to speak to us. Yep. We are just uniquely, our human psychology loves to anthropomorphize things. And after 2 years, when he revealed, Eliza isn't actually sentient, it's not conscious, it's literally just doing these hard-coded reflections of what people are saying, no one believed him. And everyone thought, oh no, we're about to recreate consciousness in computers, we're not going to need teachers anymore, we're not going to need psychologists, we're going to be able to, the jobs are going to be automated away, so on and so forth. Essentially the same exact conversation that we're having today. And it alarmed him so much that he ended up writing a huge tome called Computer Power and Human Reasoning, where even back then, he was already saying one of the most profound impacts that AI is going to have on society is allowing political and business elites to pretend that they aren't making the decisions and that AI is. But in the end, it's the AI that's actually carrying out their will.
That's very deep. You're making here a parallel with the past and the origins of, and at the same time, how very current and modern this is these days, and in terms of the legacy still is there, and the same challenges are still there in the mix. And talking then about the challenges, and I know that you've mentioned there, I absolutely love that fact that you resonated with the alternative courses of actions, which you've started talking about at the very beginning of our discussions. And I absolutely believe that there is this element of being aware of what the empire term is as part of, the traits and the research that you've done, because you're saying that the empires have never been richer, right? You're saying that by January 2025, the time that you were finishing the book, OpenAI had already reached a staggering 157 billion in terms of its valuation. And then on page 19, you're reminding us that we don't need to accept the logic of unprecedented unprecedented scale and consumption to accelerate advancement and progress. So you're saying that it could be achieved through smaller models and more diverse approaches. And I know we've tapped into a little bit more of, what can be done and how humans can push back either at the community level or maybe at some commissionary governmental level and whatnot. But do you think when it comes to the actual resources and how we're navigating through to be able to sustain this level of progress and unprecedented consumption, could we actually sustain it visibly?
No, definitely not. I'll give you two different stats. One is related to the energy consumption of these data centers, and the other one is the fresh water that's required to cool them. Mm-hmm. There was this McKinsey report that recently projected that based on the current pace of AI computational infrastructure expansion, so these massive data centers, massive supercomputers that are needed to train and deploy systems like ChatGPT, we would need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed annually by the state of California, which is, I think, the 5th largest economy in the world. We would need to add that much energy onto the global grid in the next 5 years. And that is primarily going to be serviced by fossil fuels. And that means, we've already seen documentation of coal plants that were meant to be retired that are having their lives extended specifically to power data centers. We're seeing reports of Elon Musk, his AI company, XAI, it built this massive supercomputer called Colossus in Tennessee, and he's using around 35 unlicensed methane gas turbines to power this data center. And it's pumping thousands of tons of particulates into the air, toxic particulates. So it is not sustainable in a climate sense. It is not sustainable in terms of public health. And now there was also a recent report from Bloomberg that showed that these data centers are specifically 2/3 of them are expanding into water scarce areas. But as I mentioned, these data centers need to be cooled with fresh water, because if you use non-fresh water, it will degrade the servers, it will cause bacterial growth. And if you don't use water, the equipment overheats and fries, just like when your laptop gets really, really hot from thinking it's calculating too much. Sure. And most often, it's not just fresh water, it's drinking water, because when the data centers enter communities, they have to plug into the existing infrastructure for delivering fresh water, and that is the public drinking water system. So 2/3 of the data centers are going into communities that actually do not have enough fresh drinking water. And so these pieces of infrastructure are literally competing with children for drinking water. And that is also not sustainable. So it's accelerating the climate crisis, it's accelerating the public health crisis, it's accelerating the freshwater crisis. And that doesn't even talk about the mineral extraction that's required and is escalating to build these data centers and computers in the first place. So that is part of the reason why I say that this particular pathway for AI development is extraordinarily harmful, because we will not have a planet left to help everyone live a dignified life if we continue down this course.
Is there some form of a projection? Because it's already sounding fairly alarming by the sound of it in terms of the resources that are being used at the moment. But give or take 5 or 10 years, what might be the potential scenario there? What do you think?
I mean, it's really hard to project these things because these companies purposely try and make the information necessary for doing these longer term projections secret. Mm-hmm. And, that McKinsey report, they had to essentially do a lot of estimates based on the amount of dollars that are being pumped into data center development now and the amount of energy that's being drawn by data center development now. But beyond the 5-year horizon, it's really the future gets more and more murky in terms of how much time do we have left to try and reverse all of this environmental impact before we reach the tipping point with climate change.
And talking about the climate change, I know that we've discussed just before we had this, discussion now recorded. There was this element of Elon Musk himself in 2013 when he mentioned that, the detrimental impact of AI could be, irreversible existentially in terms of it could be the end of humanity at the point. And he also likened it to the point of summoning the demon, as he was saying back then. But now it seems that he, alongside the other techies, are developing his own sort of AI power and are using his own data centers and doing pretty much the same as everybody else in the queue of the race. What do we feel the narratives are out there, and are there any form of awakened players in the field who are actually stirring the waters, just like you are at the moment with your book message, to steer the sentiment into the direction of a bit more ethical use of AI?
Yeah, first, I would love to comment on Musk summoning the demon, because this is actually a really, really core aspect of understanding the dynamics around AI development right now.
Yeah.
He was referring to this ideological belief that is really cultivated within the AI world, that AI can develop consciousness and one day will go rogue and then it will kill everyone. That's what he meant by summoning the demon. And in fact, like in my book, I quote a piece of dialogue he had with a researcher, Timnit Gebru, when she's now a very prominent AI accountability researcher, but back then she was just a graduate student at Stanford University. And she actually asked him when he came for a talk, why do you care about AI going rogue and not climate change? Because climate change is more clearly existential. This is backed by scientific documentation that it will be existential. And he said, well, rogue AI could kill everyone and climate change would not. Like even as bad as it could get, it wouldn't kill everyone. But again, there's no scientific evidence for AI developing consciousness. There's no scientific evidence for going rogue, it being able to one day kill everyone. And so that is one of the ideological bedrocks of this really distorted vision of the future, is that because climate change is less bad than potential theoretical existential risk by AI, he's willing to do things currently in the present day that accelerate the climate crisis for the hopes of potentially mitigating this future theoretical, completely unscientific existential crisis by rogue AI. And that is, he's not the only one. There's a huge community, ideological community. They are called the doomers, that believe in this potential future and then act as though no other problem in society is as important. And therefore they're willing to exacerbate all other issues, and in the hopes that maybe possibly they can prevent this existential death by AI. Mm-hmm. But to the second part of your question of, are there players that are trying to push back against this? Absolutely. I write about Timnit Gebru also started her own organization called the Distributed AI Research Group, DARE, and they are very focused on what many other researchers are now starting to gravitate towards, this idea that we shouldn't be trying to develop artificial general intelligence, a concept of everything machines. We should be trying to develop specific AI systems focused on tackling certain types of challenges that are highly computational and therefore lend themselves to the strengths of AI systems. And there's 3 different reasons why this is I believe, a much more beneficial approach. First of all, you immediately start to mitigate the harms of the scaling of the AI development that OpenAI does, which is huge amounts of data, huge amounts of resources. When you're developing much smaller task-specific AI systems, you do not need that scale. You do not need to scrape the whole internet. You do not need massive supercomputers. In fact, many beneficial AI models can be just trained on a powerful laptop, and they can be trained on maybe even a few hundred images rather than
so you don't need that much
whole
resource.
Exactly. Right. So you already eliminate the environmental harms, you eliminate the labor exploitation, also the labor automation harms, and it also becomes much more clear to the consumer how to actually deploy these AI systems correctly. One of the other harms of marketing ChatGPT as something that can do anything for you is that's actually not true. It cannot, for example, provide high quality medical information with 100% accuracy. And so when you market it as, yes, it can, we've already seen many, many cases of users trying to use ChatGPT as their therapist, trying to use it for medical guidance, and actually not getting the correct information and therefore being harmed. And then the last reason task-specific AI systems are better is because, I spoke with OpenAI researchers who mentioned it's just too hard to predict how users are going to use our systems and how they're going to ultimately harm themselves or use them abusively. So the only way to discover those abuses and harms is by first just deploying it and then seeing how the population reacts. That particular limitation of being able to not project all of the possible methods of harm is only attached to an everything machine. Of course, if you tell users you can do anything and everything, as the developer, you're going to struggle to figure out how are they going to ultimately use this technology. And so therefore you have to use the population as experimental guinea pigs. And you're using children as experimental guinea pigs to see whether or not what you developed ultimately is beneficial or not. But if you have task-specific AI systems, you can anticipate in advance. This is the bounded area, deployment use cases that people are going to use these tools in. And you can actually anticipate how it would be used harmfully and then mitigate it in advance before you even use anyone as a guinea pig for that.
So it sounds like this initiative, the DARE initiative, would also be the kind of route that would help protect the type of jobs that need not that level of automation. Because
exactly.
at the moment, to your point, the general aspect of AI seems like all jobs are at stakes for grabs, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to if there would be this element of categorization and the bounding element to it, so that it would be a lot more clearer to predict what might be the impact, and the guinea pig effect would not be as as enforced as it is at the moment, freely in that sense. And that's a fascinating point you're making, Karen. Thank you so much for it, because it does help raise that level of awareness in terms of understanding the impact and the detrimental factors aligned to it. I do have, for wrapping up, because it sounds like as a topic it's not going to be ever enough to kind of explore it to do its justice. But I'm going to look a little bit into this element of the short and flash Q&As that I absolutely love, because it helps infuse a little bit more of a engagement factor in it, in the discussion along the side of what's being done already. So in terms of the research that you've put, amazing fascinating level of details that you've put in the book as well, what was the moment that changed your mind about OpenAI? Because you yourself have mentioned earlier in the book that you used to be an adept of OpenAI in the early days.
I was open to what OpenAI was positioning themselves as
an NGO, isn't it?
Yeah, as a nonprofit and as a mission-driven organization. I went into the reporting on the organization just wondering, okay, let's take it at face value and see if that's true. But what changed my mind was just the 3 days that I spent at the company. It became very clear that as much as they were trying to position themselves as an anti-Silicon Valley, they were actually just completely embedded within the culture of Silicon Valley.
So all for profit. If you could ask Sam Altman one honest question right now, what would it be?
What degree of harm do you need to see in order to change course?
What's the one thing about AI you wish more people truly understood?
That you actually have an active role in shaping its future.
And that's the core, isn't it, about the whole discussion we also had today. If the planet could vote, would it approve of AGI?
No.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's destroying the planet right now. So I think the planet would have something to say about that.
If they knew the actual impact and the detrimental factors of it, then they would actually vote against it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. If we continue at the current trajectory with acceleration over accountability and corporate power unchecked, what does our world look like in 5 to 10 years? And who has the agency and who's left behind?
we would return back to an age of empire where people at the top get to decide whatever they want based on their self-interest and potentially cause huge amounts of harm to society, to the environment, to labor rights, and everyone else would be left behind.
If you had a superpower, what would it be?
Magically make everyone have more empathy.
Woohoo! To that, I would raise a glass if anything, right? And the final bit, because as I told you earlier, before we started off, I'm also a mommy, right? I'm quite concerned about, making sure that the younger ones are a little bit more clear in terms of their choices and what they have to deal with when they're building their own skill set. So my question is around skills. What would you advise the next generation to focus on? So not just to stay relevant, but also stay human, empowered, and essential in the age of intelligent machines.
Focus on your critical thinking. Foster your curiosity. Those are inherently human things that can never be replaced, and it will help guide and shape your choices throughout the rest of your life.
Karen, that's golden. Thank you so much for our discussion today. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you so much for having me.